Much, Paul, for the I was going to say kind introduction, but I'm not sure if it was really. You realise that as you've made the comments first, that I'll be able to get back at you during the talk. But no, I'm very honoured to be here with such a nice audience and a lovely room, and I'm delighted that you've asked me. So thank you very much. I see that my title's got obscured actually, but I was thinking on the train coming up that I could change it to Friday night is murder night, but but it might be a little bit frivolous. So you can see what I'm going to talk about. The first bit is that perhaps the serious bit, some current data on healthcare serial killers, and then a bit lighter hearted, if you can say that about murder, what I've called the single killers, who are mainly doctors who've murdered their wives. But I put single in inverted commas because some of them have murdered more than one wife, and some, for good measure, have bumped off the mother-in-law as well. I couldn't possibly comment as the talk is being recorded and my mother-in-law is still alive. And then at the end, I'm going to give you some examples, just looking at the sort of the judicial sort of aspects. So let's just look at some of the data first for the healthcare serial killers. And I'm very grateful to Beatrice Crofts-Yorker for sending me this data pre-publication this year. She goes by the very long title. It's longer than Paul's title, actually. It's Professor of Nursing, Criminal Justice and Criminality at the University of California in Los Angeles. She's written the most comprehensive accounts and data, has the biggest databases of healthcare serial killers. And you can see along the bottom that they come from various countries. There are no countries that don't have some healthcare serial killers. I've put some green arrows for the home nations, if you can see from the back. And the point I really wanted to make from this data was, since the 1970s, are we on any? Oh, it's deliberate. I thought there was a power cut. Yeah, most of this data is since the 1970s. Before the 70s, it was harder to collect. Nobody had the ability and the databases weren't there. So in the last 50 years, there have been about 150 odd prosecutions, of which the conviction rate is nearly 80%, which isn't bad. That's higher than for general murder or other murders, one could say. Of course, that's the number of prosecutions. If you think about the number of murders, some of the worst characters, like Shipman, have murdered hundreds of patients. So the actual number of deaths resulting from these people is probably into the thousands. So they occur in every country. And who are the perpetrators? Well, you can see on the right that the largest group of murderers are nurses. So registered nurses, I guess nursing age, what we'd call healthcare assistants, and doctors are not insignificant, so much smaller, but they're still well over 10%. And the methods employed are shown on the left. So most are intravenous injections of medications, and I'll show you those next. But there's a variety of other methods, air embolus, bleach. You might remember in the recent Lucy Letby case, I think there's some allegations of air embolus in some of those children, suffocation. And there was a group of nurses in Austria who sedated some patients and then put an ET tube down and put water down it. So there's a lot of nasty methods. I'm a bit worried about that lady taking notes at the back there. So what sort of medications do people use? Well, you can see that a lot of cardiac drugs. In the 60s and 70s, or 70s, 80s, digoxin used to be used a lot, but that's gone out of vogue. You don't see much IV digoxin, but a lot of potassium chloride, some adrenaline, as well as heparin. Respiratory paralyzing agents are popular. They're not locked up like control drugs, but by far the biggest categories are opiates and insulin. So insulin accounts for over a quarter, and in fact, since 2006, insulin has increased by about 40%. And I would add, as I'm in Yorkshire, the first published case of a healthcare professional who murdered somebody with insulin was in Leeds. There's a chap called Kenneth Barlow, who was a nurse, and he murdered his pregnant 32-year-old wife. He tried to make it look like she drowned in the bath, but his account of events was suspicious. And the police found, police at post-mortem, the pathologist found injection marks on her buttocks, and he was found guilty. This was in 1957. Okay, why do you think insulin might be so popular? Am I allowed audience participation?
Yeah.
Anybody want to shout any reasons out?
Access.
Access? Yeah, easy access or easier than controlled drugs. Yeah. Oh, did I do that or did that just come on? Anything else?
It works.
Works well. Yeah. Yeah. Does work. Yeah.
Evidence-based.
Evidence. Yeah. EVM can be evidence-based medicine or evidence-based murder. Yeah. Okay, I won't draw that out. Yes, there's been a lot written about insulin. There have been various reports calling it the perfect crime. So, right, welcome back to the online people. You were censored. So yes, easy access or easier than controlled drugs. You need a high index of suspicion in a non-diabetic to think about insulin. People don't ask for it. If you ask for a drug screen, you're going to get drugs what do you get? Street drugs in York, opiates, ketamine, tranquilizers, anything that I saw those police vans outside when I was coming in. But you don't automatically think about insulin. And it takes quite a long time to get to a hypoglycemic coma, several hours, by which time the murderer has probably left the premises. And the tox is very challenging. So this is a whole book, Insulin Murders, written by Professor Vincent Marks, who actually helped me with an article I wrote for our alumni magazine. He was one of the first people to use the immunoassay for insulin, and he was an expert witness at a lot of murder trials for insulin. Post-mortem glucose is not of any value, and insulin is rapidly hemolyzed after death. So it's a good bet to use it. Okay, it does last for longer in the vitreous humor. I'm just going to say to Paul, that's as a psychiatrist, that's in the eye. I've got to get back at him. I've got to get back at him now. He was. So I'll stop. So those are some of the methods for the serial killers. What about the motives? There isn't much to suggest that the healthcare professions attract people with a pathological interest in harming people. It seems that most transform on the job. Talking of evidence-based medicine that you mentioned before, I read a lot of psychology articles, and they are all speculation because generally serial murderers never admit their guilt, like Harold Shipman. Therefore, they never say what the motives were. So it's all complex, it's all speculation. But one of the key features seems to be different methods of gaining attention. So factitious disorder is one form, or factitious disorder by proxy, Munchausen's by proxy. Some of the nurses particularly are frustrated. They talk about paying back an unfair system. And then you've got the mercy killers, the missionaries who say they're just easing the patient's passing, which in fact is just a performance of words when really they're just as set on murder as anybody else. The power and control base seems to be much more the doctors, the power to save lives and the power to take lives. But there was a lovely line that I read for one nurse who was being described. It gave her a small realm of power in an otherwise powerless world. And here's somebody who gained attention in the 90s. Some of you might remember Beverly Allett. So she had Munchausen's as a young person herself. She had lots of episodes of self-harm. And then she murdered 4 children when she was a state-enrolled nurse in 1991 at Grantham Hospital in Lincolnshire. And suspicion arose about her because there were a number of kids with unexplained collapses, and they were sent to the tertiary centre, which was the Queen's Medical Centre in Nottingham, and they had, in a 2-month period when she was working there, double the number that they'd had from Grantham in the previous year. And she was investigated and then sentenced. There was a lot of issues then, discussion about is Munchausen's by proxy really an illness? Is it a disease? The parents of a lot of the victims felt she was bad, not mad. So they described it as this mythical malady. There was a little flurry of press activity in 2021 because she'd served 30 years, which was her mandatory minimum sentence. She had been originally sent to prison, but the prison staff thought that she was a suicide risk, and she had some elements then of mental illness. So she's been in a secure hospital since that time. But you can't be granted parole from a secure hospital, only from prison. So she put herself before a mental health assessment in 2023, trying to get a transfer, but this was turned down. And in fact, she's got to wait another 3 years. So Beverly Allitt is the sort of gaining attention by factitious disorder. Another group are the thrill seekers, people who may have low self-esteem. And here are some nurses that I'm mentioning, and I put the reasons in bold, but they like the thrill of actually running to the rest, resuscitating the patients that they didn't actually kill. This was a chap in Horton Hospital in Banbury. He used respiratory paralyzing agent. Unusually, he was actually caught with a syringe full of paralyzing agent in his pocket, which helped the prosecution case. And there's a chap here from the States. He liked the respect and admiration he got from his colleagues when he performed well at a cardiac arrest. And I hope none of us end up in hospital soon, but if you do, just bear in mind how we treat the nurses, because this chap, Mr. Majors, his colleagues at trial said that they could predict which patients were going to die, those that were demanding, whiny, or disproportionately added to his workload. So when I'm in hospital, I'm not saying anything but thank you to the nurses. The last nurse I want to mention in the serial killers part is this chap, Victorina Chua, because there are some similarities here to the recent case of Lucy Letby, who we remember from Chester. So he was originally from the Philippines, and he was employed in another tropical paradise, Stockport. And he killed a number of frail, elderly, infirm patients. And his modus operandi was that he used insulin. He injected insulin into saline bags in the treatment room. This was one of the pictures that was used as trial evidence. But unlike Mr. Majors, who went for the moaning patients, he didn't know who his victims were going to be, because he went home and then some nurses unwittingly would take the saline bags loaded with high doses of insulin and put them up on patients. But the similarity with Letby is that he had based his confession on a long handwritten note. He'd had some counselling the year before he started his killing sprees, talked about himself being an angel, then turning evil, and the prosecution used this as strong evidence to interpret it as a confession, and the judge used that to direct the jury. So there's the note. I was going to call on the chair to read it out, but I think as we've had a delay, we won't read the whole note out. But he has this similarity to Letby, and you can see at the bottom it says here there's a devil in me note that was seized by police from his house. This was pointed out by the head of sort of the Northwest Journalist Hub, the Manchester Evening News, the striking parallels between Letby and the killer nurse. And before we move on serial killers, I think we just have to say that for doctors, I mentioned it's this power thing, the power to save life or take life. And of course, Shipman was an arch example of this. He never declared his motives. He always maintained his innocence until he died by suicide in 2004. And even at the Shipman inquiry chaired by Claire Smith, after hearing all the evidence and analysing all this, she said, I regret to say I can shed very little light on why Shipman killed his patients. But there is this view that people get addicted to killing, the serial killers. It's a bit like an addiction. And Beatrice Croft-Yorker says that they keep having to reinforce their desire to kill. Okay, I'm going to move on to the single killers. I'm watching the time, Paul, it's fine. Now, I said that the motives for the serial killers are very complex. Complex or unknown speculation. The motives for the for the single killers are much simpler. Anybody like to hazard a guess? Two main motives. Very good. Passion and money. I guess if we were in France, you'd say passion, wouldn't you? I was going to say mistress because they tend to be male, but passion and money, yes. So that's their motives. Yeah, they tend to be all male in unhappy marriages who want to dispose of their wife. Yes, passion,
Don't worry, dear.
passion and money. Not only do they want to make some money, some of the early ones in the 19th century had addictions. They needed the money. They needed the money to continue their lifestyle. Of course, murder could be considered last resort. There are other options. Divorce was very difficult in the 19th century. It wasn't straightforward. So it may be easier now, but it can be expensive. And there were other options, particularly at markets in medieval times. Now, did anybody here qualify at Barts? Okay, nobody.
Got a couple of minutes.
Okay. I'm actually married to a Barts nurse. I'd like to turn the recording off and say you can always tell a Barts nurse, but you can't tell her much. I'm just mumbling because I don't want that to show on the recording. Anyway, round the corner from Barts is Smithfield Market, which has recently closed, I believe. But when I was there last year, accompanying my wife on yet another reunion, there were these very interesting information boards, and it seems that markets were much more interesting in the old days. Public executions, hanging, disemboweling, and scenes of torture. But I want to draw your attention to the bottom bit. The wife sale became popular in the 19th century. Divorce was difficult, and men could bring their unwanted wives along with normal goods to the meat market. So you didn't have to murder your wife. There were other legitimate options. I just think it's such a shame that Smithfield meat market's closed. So in the 19th century, how did you murder somebody? Well, it was a heyday for poisoners. And some of the poisons were from plants. This is aconitine, quite pretty blue flowers, but very poisonous. It has other names, I think, monksfoot, wolfbane. I think it's from the ranunculus family, for those of you that go to garden centres. Strychnine, Strychnos vomica, so that causes convulsions, respiratory paralysis. The opium poppy. So there were plant poisons, and then heavy metals came in, like arsenic, and then later cyanide. And arsenic was particularly useful because the symptoms from arsenic poisoning mimicked cholera, which was quite prevalent at the time. So it was relatively easy for people to poison somebody, symptoms of cholera, sign the death certificate for cholera, cremate the body, and that's the end of it. How did they get hold of these? Well, a lot came from pesticides, or rodenticides, as we call it, for rat poisons. So here's an advert from the States, safe, sane, and sanitary. This one, poison rough on rats, absolute death to all rats. And here's the description from the 1920s. I like the way it says significant drawbacks. It just sort of puts that in. A lack of a reliable antidote means that non-target poisonings to people is often fatal. This is rhodine. Rhodine, the active ingredient is yellow phosphorus. Phosphorus was used in firework production, matches, fertilizer, very toxic. It rapidly dehydrates the rats, which sounds quite unpleasant. And for people, it's hepatotoxic, so they died of liver failure. So a lot of interesting poisons were available in the 19th century. And I'll show you three examples of how these were used. So this is an example with aconitine poisoning. And I think all the doctors were devious because they all thought they wouldn't be caught and they would get away with it. This is Dr. George Lamson. So as Paul said, I moved to the pharmaceutical industry. When I first moved to GSK, some of you might remember before all the generic products, the respiratory products were all marketed under the Allen and Hanbury label. Do you remember those? Ventolin, Becotide, I think Flixotide early on was. We used to be quite proud of A&H actually, but sadly it was used for poison for this chap. So he got his aconitine from Allen and Hanbury's. At low doses, it has therapeutic effects. It's antipyretic and analgesic, but it has a narrow therapeutic index, so you soon get into toxicity. So it's cardiotoxic and neurotoxic. He had a morphine addiction, and his practice in Bournemouth wasn't doing well. His wife had a lot of money. One of her siblings had already died, and he wanted to get the family assets under his control. So he went off to bump the other brother-in-law, Percy, off. He put aconitine in a portion of Dundee cake and also presented him with some capsules, which he said would make him stronger. He did this because he was told during his medical studies in Edinburgh that aconitine was not measurable. You wouldn't detect it at post-mortem. But unfortunately for him, forensic science had moved on since he'd qualified, and here he is being tried at the Old Bailey. So he was found guilty, and he was hanged at Wandsworth Prison in the late 19th century. So he used aconitine. This chap, William Palmer, the so-called Rugeley poisoner, he used strychnine, which I showed you comes from the plant, a potent convulsant. So you get death by muscle paralysis, particularly the diaphragm, so you have asphyxia, you can't breathe. He was a bit of a naughty character going through. He had a lot of criminal record, and he murdered his mother-in-law, his wife, and then he fell out with a racing crony over a bet at the horse races. In fact, he was only tried for one murder, that of John Cook, because the police found the strongest evidence for him. And his trial at the Old Bailey in the middle of the 19th century was a big showpiece. There was a lot of interest, and his was the first trial for using strychnine as a murder weapon. He was also of interest in himself to the press. He was described as one of a new breed of bourgeois villains. So the bourgeois villain, he was hung at Stafford Jail in 1856. So no appeals in those days, no hanging around on death row like you hear in the States. And the last one I've got as an example from the 19th century was this respected Dr. Edward Pritchard from Glasgow. I put a bit of the story on the left there. His wife became ill with this mysterious illness of vomiting and cramps. She was going downhill. And then unfortunately for Dr. Pritchard, her mother came to help. And her mother started making the food and giving her drinks. And he couldn't get the poison in. So she made a very good recovery. She started improving suspiciously. But then a few weeks into the mother-in-law's visit, she suddenly died, and 3 weeks later, his wife died as well. Interestingly, we're in an era where we talk about whistleblowers and anonymous lines of reporting people, and people don't want to speak up because your career's ruined. In the descriptions about this chap in Glasgow, it said that some of his medical colleagues did suspect him of foul play, but out of professional courtesy, they kept quiet and said nothing. I'm not sure whether that should happen. Would that happen in York? No. Anyway, there was an anonymous letter, probably by one of the family's physicians who he'd kept at arm's length. But they exhumed the two bodies and they found a cocktail of poison in them. So his motives were both money and the mistress. His wife had a heavy life insurance policy, which he was about to inherit. And his mistress, well, I support mistress in inverted commas, she was a maidservant, aged 17, called Mary MacLeod. And she testified at his trial that the good Dr. Pritchard had said he was going to marry her when his wife died, which, of course, he would say that, wouldn't he? So those are three examples of sort of 19th century poisons. And then as we move to the 20th century, we start to see other things in use. I'm not going to talk through this slide, but it was just to illustrate, could we see a Dr. Pritchard case again where you sign off your own wife's death certificate? There is more scrutiny nowadays with the medical examiner system. I'm sure somebody very devious could still get through the system, but hopefully there's a bit less scope. Okay, let's move to the 20th century where the medical murderers chose newer drugs. I'm sure most of you will have heard of Dr. Crippen, very famous or infamous. I think he's still at Madame Tussauds. So you'll remember he was an American doctor, came over to London with his wife. She was called Cora, and she was a singer and a dancer. That was her stage name. And then she suddenly disappeared. He told her friends that she'd gone back to the USA and then that she'd had an illness and died, but the friends didn't believe him. The police, they reported him to the police, who found that he had made a very large purchase of, does anybody know which drug was used for Crippen? Hyoscine, okay, the anticholinergic drug hyoscine. He'd used hyoscine. So the police had various searches, and it was only on the fourth search that they found her dismembered body in the cellar. Um, so there he is at the Old Bailey with his mistress, Ethel Leneve, who looks about to visit some beehives, I think. So he was found guilty. She was found not guilty, and she went back to the States on the day that he was hung in London. A lot of these murders have captured the public's imagination, a lot of books and films. So this was a film at one point about Dr. Crippen, and this was the tagline. I think it's rather good, isn't it? If you want to remember your wife, send flowers. If you want to dismember her, see Dr. Crippen. Now, does anybody remember how he was caught? Yes, on a transatlantic ship. Oh, look, I've lost the whole thing now. Yeah, a transatlantic ship. And what was the historical thing about it? Why isn't there a mouse here? Oh, there it is. Aha.
Radio transmission.
Yeah, Marconi's radio transmission had just been invented. So it was the first use to capture criminal of the wireless telegram. In fact, he went with Ethel Leneve to Antwerp, and then they caught the ship over to Montreal. But the captain sent this telegram saying, Crippen, London cellar murderer among the saloon passengers. Accomplice dressed as a boy, voice, manner, and build definitely, undoubtedly a girl. So the detective in charge of the case got a faster ship, got to Montreal, and he was arrested and brought back to England, tried and hung. Okay, as a slight tangent off this, not only has the Crippen sort of saga produced a book, a film, does anybody else know? It's produced something that Paul's very fond of. Very close. A band. Doctor and the Crippins. So this was a band, and they were in the late 80s, early 90s, hardcore punk and thrashcore. I think they were also a quite interesting bunch. If you're eagle-eyed and you can read, I don't know if you can read from the back the past members, but two of the band members, one was called Tom Crippen and one was called Wayne Kripensky. Exactly. And Jesus. So they were this thrashcore band and inspired by Dr. Crippen's murder. And I just was checking to update the data for the talk to make sure they hadn't reformed or anything. And I was randomly on Google directed to this website, just some punk songs. And I had to put this in because it made me laugh out loud. But somebody called Daz in May of this year made a comment that the Doctor and the Crippins gig at the Tash in Blackpool was one of the greatest nights of my life. He's obviously never had a night at the York Medical Society. Anyway, let me move on. So what about the 21st century? Well, the motives have remained unchanged, as you said, passion and money. The behavior traits of the perpetrators have remained unchanged. Really, it's devious behavior and a conviction that you're not going to get caught. But what has changed, we're seeing a lot more innovative delivery methods. So here are a couple of emergency room physicians from the United States. The first one, Yasid Essa, he had suggested to his wife that it would be a good idea for her to take some more calcium to prevent osteoporosis, which is her mum had got, and he had been talking about it. The bottom line was that he emptied the capsules with the calcium and he put some cyanide in and poisoned his wife. So an old drug in a new form. And this Dr. Michael McNeil from Utah, he suggested that his wife have a facelift. So beware if any of the chaps say, you should go for cosmetic surgery. And then post-op, he drugged her with analgesics, diazepam, and sleeping pills before trying to make out she'd drowned in the bathtub of their home. He was a very well-standing member of the community in Utah. He was a Mormon and he had 8 children, and it was the various children who got suspicious about them. So Yaz actually escaped for a bit. He went to Lebanon, where apparently he openly bragged about what he had done, and there's no extradition with the US. He then booked a flight to Cyprus some years later, no, 17 months later, under a false name, but the FBI had kept tabs on him, and he was arrested. So he's still in prison. And Michael McNeil, he managed to live 10 years after he killed his wife in 2007, and then he committed suicide. So a couple of different methods, but for me, the Oscar goes to this guy, Professor Kim Sun. He was a Malaysian anesthesiologist. He was trained actually in Britain, so I could say anesthetist. Now he used a yoga ball. What do you think? How can a yoga ball be used for murder? Does anybody go to yoga here? And do you have a yoga ball? Okay. Okay. Any ideas? It's about the contents of the yoga ball. What do you think? What could you put in a yoga ball that could be harmful?
A gas?
A gas. A gas. Yeah. What gas would you pick? You don't have to answer that. You don't have to incriminate yourself. Well, he filled his wife's yoga ball with carbon monoxide, and he took out the stopper, and it slowly leaked out in the boot of her Mini. I think this was in 2015. He kept the stopper, actually was found by the police in the top drawer of his desk, and this was a big part of the evidence that incriminated him. So his wife drove off with the yoga ball. The carbon monoxide was released. They parked. She felt unwell. They parked, and sadly, she died alongside with one of their daughters was in the car. So it was pretty sad, really. He has had several appeals. He's appealed on various grounds of legal irregularities. He had some cock and bull story that the carbon monoxide was just to take home to kill rabbits or test on rats. But in fact, all his appeals have been turned down, and this year marked the end of his high-profile case. So he looks like he's going to be staying in prison for life. But a yoga ball, so just have a think about it when you next get your yoga ball out. Now I'm just going to turn to a sort of judicial aspect to illustrate the last few cases. So if you have a civil case, then you're talking about a balance of probabilities, what you call in America a preponderance of evidence. So I guess that's like the Brexit vote, 58-42, that would be a balance of probabilities. Whereas for a criminal case, you have to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. There's nothing numerical put on reasonable doubt. There are various definitions, if you search on it, about that you have to be convinced enough that there is no rational doubt that the decision is wrong, etc., etc. It's not like in my old life running a clinical trial when you're looking at a p-value of 0.05 and you need to be 95% certain that the drug produced the result that you saw. So how does beyond reasonable doubt fit? Um, are some perpetrators not detected? Well, that's an unanswerable question. Is it the tip of the iceberg? Do we have some that, get away with it and we really don't know about, particularly the serial killers? I asked Beatrice Crofts-Yorker this, and there is no answer to that. What about circumstantial evidence? Can you convict easily on circumstantial evidence? Well, not necessarily easily, but there are a lot of convictions on circumstantial evidence. So here's an example from 2000 and when is it? 2012, I think. This is Dr. Brian Cricket. He was a GP in nice suburbs in Sydney, Australia, and he killed his wife allegedly with a lethal injection of insulin so he could get her life insurance and start a new life with his lover. Same motives. Interestingly, there were no traces of insulin found in Mrs. Cricket's body. So I said to you that insulin hemolyzes very quickly, very difficult. And in fact, the suspicion arose only because her family was suspicious. The police reinvestigated, and according to Professor Vincent Marks, who provided an expert report to the New South Wales police on this case, they looked at photographs. They didn't exhume the body. They looked at photos from the post-mortem several months later and identified a couple of injection sites on her buttock. But what he had done was, first of all, on his computer the day before, he had searched for what is the lethal dose of insulin to give somebody. And I'm no IT expert, but I think even if you press delete and then you empty the recycle bin, it's still there. So I can see somebody at the back taking notes. Use somebody else's computer if you want to do a search. And also he issued a couple of prescriptions for patients, which he filled for fast-acting insulin. So on those grounds, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to 27 years in jail. He appealed the following year on the grounds that his wife's post-mortem failed to provide any cause of death, and therefore you couldn't say it was murder. But in fact, his appeal was also turned down. So, he's a good example of getting sentenced, I think, on circumstantial evidence. Are some innocent people wrongly convicted? Well, I'm going to gloss over this one quickly because I think I want to talk about Lucy Letby a bit. But this is a guy, a nurse in Leeds actually, who was convicted of murdering several very frail elderly patients who had hypoglycemia. According to Vincent Marks, the index case was foul play because the insulin was very high, the C-peptide was low, suggesting exogenous insulin. But since he was convicted, there has been evidence now that very elderly, ill people can have spontaneous hypoglycemia. This actually went back to the Court of Appeal this year, but the judge threw it out and said that sudden and severe hypoglycemia was just, no new evidence, and that the possibility of dying by natural causes was explored during his original trial. So we can come back to him if you want to, but I think the key person who's always coming up at the moment, and the new barrister, Mark MacDonald, who seems to be running her appeal by press release, doesn't he, and press conference and his expert committee. So I'm not going to comment on any views, whether she's guilty or innocent, but I think you can see that there has been a groundswell of trying to get her case sent back to the Criminal Cases Review Commission for appeal, although it has already been turned down. But I just wanted to highlight for her the difficulties for a lay jury in arriving at a verdict beyond reasonable doubt. If you think about it, all the evidence is circumstantial. There hasn't been any forensic evidence, no eyewitnesses. There is a risk of bias, which I think has been highlighted a lot by several reports and press articles. Adding these circumstances together, each one might look a bit weak, but when you put it together, it does paint a picture. A lot's been made, for example, of the stats with the fact that she was there for all the cases where the babies unexpectedly died. And then there's the accusations that the medical expert cherry-picked those cases. And then the other challenges for the jury. Can a jury understand the intricate scientific evidence? How is it interpreted? Who do they believe when the prosecution says one thing and the defense says another? And the complex physiology of neonates. And I just put in one example of this, which was actually the insulin cases, as I'm interested in insulin. These were attempted murders, so that she didn't actually murder anybody by insulin, but it's claim and counterclaim. The prosecution started off with a fairly straightforward picture of low blood sugar, very high insulin, and low C-peptide in a couple of infants. So it did look like there was exogenous insulin given. The defense then came up with a counterclaim that the assay of the insulin wasn't at forensic standards. It was only at NHS clinical standards. You really need to separate the samples into two. You need to have them both done, duplicate samples, etc., for court. And then in one of the documentaries that I saw, of which there've been at least 3 or 4, they'd wheeled out a biomedical engineer, not a medic as an expert, saying that neonates have an antibody which binds insulin, so insulin sticks around longer, it's much higher, and this clouds the situation. So it could have been natural, and Letby wasn't even on shift on one occasion. And then you get the prosecution coming back with a counterclaim saying the clinical testing of insulin is fine, it has only a 0.5% error rate, and that insulin was, rocketingly high. The antibody theory is implausible. Only those 2 people believe in it. And maybe she put insulin into the feed bags on the previous shift. So I think this just sort of highlights the complexities for the jury, and we can come back and discuss that. And remember, that's just for one of the cases that, she's got multiple methods that she's alleged to have used. Okay, have some guilty murderers been acquitted? Just coming up to my last case. Does anybody recognize this man? 1957.
In
Bournemouth, Eastbourne.
Was he Bodkin?
Same coast.
Yeah.
Bodkin Adams.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that your surname? Are you a relation? Are you a relation?
Well, who's he?
Well, he was never convicted of murder, so maybe it wasn't that bad. But yeah, of Irish origin, he had a practice in Eastbourne, and he seemed to cultivate rich elderly widows as his patient. And he's suspected of sort of easing the passing of 200 or 300 wealthy patients, and he got away with this. It's thought that yeah, they are trial of the century. But it's thought that the police and the prosecution messed it all up. He was only tried for one person, for one murder, but that wasn't unusual in the 50s. You went for the case where the evidence was the strongest. But the police failed to investigate. They didn't get all the evidence from his surgery, apparently. The prosecution thought it was absolutely open and shut and did a poor job and were pretty incompetent. So he actually got off the murder charge, although he was found guilty of various other things. I think prescription fraud, failing to have a controlled drugs register, obstructing the police, and a few other minor things. But yeah, trial of the century at the time, and he got off, and I think he was reinstated on the medical register. But whether he went back to murder or not, we don't know. Now, I said to you, a lot of these murders that are infamous are made into books and films. And yes, no difference with him. There's the book, The Curious Habits of Dr. Adams. So nobody's accusing him. He's just saying it was curious. Like an Agatha Christie gone wrong. And the film was The Good Dr. Bodkin Adams. I don't know if you can read from the back, but the writer was Richard Gordon, who you might remember wrote all the Doctor in the House books, etc. So Richard Gordon wrote the screenplay, and it had a top cast. So Timothy West, who died last year, and his widow died a couple of weeks ago. Did you pick that up? Prunella Scales, who was Mrs. Faulty. Yeah, I think they used to do canal trips, didn't they, later in life? But back in the day, he was the good Dr. Bodkin Adams. Okay, so I don't want to end Friday night on a gloomy note. I don't want you to think, harm is coming your way. But the chances of being harmed by a healthcare serial killer are very low. So don't worry, rest assured. It's estimated to be less than 1 in 2 million healthcare professionals who have harmful intent. It may be dropping because there are electronic medical records, medication is more strictly controlled, hiring practices are better. People take up references more these days because a lot of these serial killers in particular move from one institution to another. And they go for vulnerable patients, so babies, children, and then the very elderly. So I'm giving you that possible note of reassurance. And I'm going to end on a question. Why are there so few female murderers? They really are all men, the ones who've murdered their spouses. Do you think the women are more subtle and just don't get caught? They're cleverer? Or do you think they're not carrying out these crimes? So I'll leave you with that question. And thank you for listening. So this is where I live in Bath, and where a lot of my neighbours call it Bath. And when I used to be a GP, we had to dress up at least once a year. We used to go on home visits. Remember that? Do GPs go on home visits? We used to have home visits. Yeah, and you might think I went with my practice nurse. You might think I'm saying, put out your tongue, but I'm really saying, will you change your will? And on that note, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that talk there. And you did stay to time, which is very impressive, I think, actually. And I certainly picked up a lot of tips about what to get the Christmas presents this year. I think a new yoga ball is certainly a possibility. And I was also interested to hear that Ken Barlow, as early as 1957, was
before he was on Corrie.
Before
yeah.
So thank you very much. That was a brilliant talk and insightful. And I kind of wonder what are the motives for doctors beyond the ordinary person, and whether doctors have more likelihood of becoming murderers. I don't think you quite put it that, do you? Is it likely?
I think nurses are more likely to become murderers.
Yes,
I think they have more opportunity, and there are certainly in numbers. I mean, there are a lot. Obviously, I gave examples. There are lots more, and there are lots of other doctors, but the nursing profession has larger numbers than the doctor profession, and I think the nurses are more likely to become killers. But you can't really foresee or predict which ones are going to become killers because it's such an anomalous, nasty event. I think there are personality traits where people talk about the people to watch are those that change jobs frequently, that like to do night shifts where they're not supervised, and so on. But that doesn't mean they're all going to be murderers.
Just before I ask for questions, I was at a St. Peter's School public lecture the week, and David Davis, the MP, was there, and he's been quite vocal about testing innocence, so the lack of evidence.
Yeah.
And he said that Lucy Ledley was under 7 of 18 cases of babies becoming ill, but obviously I wasn't there, so I can't really comment. But
well, he has been an advocate, I think, more than saying the case should be re-examined. I think he's saying it needs to go back to the Court of Appeal. He's not as convinced of her guilt at all. But I think as far as I can see from reading all the stuff, there was evidence that she was there at more cases than that.
Right.
But it's whether you believe that some of it could have been natural causes in a poorly performing unit as against deliberate harm.
So I'm going to invite questions from the audience there. So Nick, start with you.
Nick Bosenket, there's a memorial to my ancestor, very fine in Bath Abbey next time.
Oh, right, okay. You have to tell me afterwards. Right.
Thank you very much for your lecture. Shouldn't you add to your inquiries the area of assisted dying by doctors, which is a huge story comparing birds. For example, between 1890 and 1930, there was a halving of infant mortality, but no fall in mortality in the first 2 days of the infant's life. Nobody has actually explained. And also, after the panel system started, that was the first time doctors, the last illness of males. From what I know, relatives in the West, they used to put a packet of pills behind a big clock, saying, if the pain gets too bad, give him some of these.
Yeah, I think
There were 2 areas.
yes, I agree. But would you call it depends whether you want to call that murder or easing their passing, because people used to up the dose of morphine, didn't they, as well? Not just leave the packet of pills behind the clock, but often I think the morphine doses were given higher than needed to be therapeutically. So yes, I could well enlarge it for the future. Yeah.
The doctrine of double effect, is that still allowed? Or we just practiced subtly these days? Yeah. Interesting. Thank you very much for that. Wasn't really a question as much as a statement, but thank you for that. Any other questions or tips? Well, people in the audience. Yes, Bill.
Serial killers, I don't know how many killers be a serial killer, but they don't tend to use the same method. It's interesting that different methods can be.
Yeah, she's used a lot of different methods. Actually, I think most of the serial killers have used the same method. Most in Beatrice Croft's Yorker series have used the same method because they found it reliable, and they keep going back to it until they get caught. So I think Lucy Letby is unusual in that case, because she's had the injection, which might have been intra-arterial, may have been intravenous. There's the tubes. Did she pump air into the stomachs or into the yeah? So I think that case is unusual, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, I think the other thing for Letby at the moment is that the police started looking at when she had an attachment at Liverpool Children's Hospital, Liverpool Women's Hospital, and I saw a preliminary report saying that the endotracheal tubes came out much more often, 40% higher than when she wasn't on shift. So yeah, there's lots of different methods and lots of suspicion, I think.
As a neurologist, and I've always thought that insulin was actually a really bad way of killing people, because I've seen so many people rendered incapable and damaged, but then on ITU for some months, but not dead.
From yeah, you've got to look at. Are you saying that you've seen those cases from insulin being given to cause harm?
Is this a tip you're giving?
Okay. Yeah.
Very it's going to be happening that you hear in one with insulin. And I tried to get people to investigate it. By the time the police did go around, the completely tied in wheat.
So 2 needs is suspicious in itself, but as I pointed out, it's very hard to get evidence for insulin. You really need a pre-death blood sample because it's hemolyzed so quickly after death. So if you exhume a body a couple of weeks after death, opiates and things will still be hanging around, but insulin will have disappeared. But then on the other hand, I showed you the example from Australia, Dr. Cricket, where he was convicted on his circumstantial evidence, and no insulin or cause of death was ever found for his wife.
He has to be concerned that circumstantial evidence is the only evidence, certainly with the recent case.
I think insulin's quite good, actually, myself.
Because he said we had no rumors
he had been to his house and treated
Hmm.
his children, treated him. And he's a sensible, intelligent person. He said, not a clue.
Hmm.
And I think that was interesting for me when I was convicted. My friend to this day says, I just don't know. And he had personal contact with Harold Shipman. I'm not a doctor myself. He had personal contact with Harold Shipman and said,
Well, I think you make an interesting point in that some serial killers are very caring and methodical and technically good. So if somebody had gone into Shipman, we had all this discussion when revalidation was brought in for doctors, wasn't it, because of Shipman? And everybody said, well, Shipman would do revalidation brilliantly. He'd had all the paperwork. His audits would have been great. And the funny thing was, when I first joined GSK, my boss at the time, who'd been a GP in the Northwest, he had presented Harold Shipman with the Allen and Hambury Asthma Prize a few years before, because he'd done audits of asthma care and it all looked pretty immaculate. So I think that's true. And people have great faith, don't they, in the personal relationship with the doctor. So you can imagine why people were totally shocked about Shipman. People don't fit your ordinary person's expectation of what a murderer should appear like. And I think that's been the same in the Lucy Letby case. People have thought, well, she doesn't look like a murderer. She's too sweet a girl. Yeah. And Beverly Ella, actually, I think one of the parents asked her to be the godmother of one of the. She murdered one of the twins and was made the godmother of the other one because she was so caring. So, yeah, I think all this underlines how deceiving appearances can be.
The charismatic psychopath is a description.
Charismatic and attentive. Yeah.
So who can tell?
Yeah.
Is dead, and a fourth partner of the surgery was tried in York for excessive use of that excellent painkiller for back pain, morphine, that he taken from the cupboard in the surgery. And the judge said it'd been a pleasure to try such an outstanding young man and let him off completely.
Wow, that's amazing.
He didn't practice.
Thank you. Greg, do you have a question?
I'm sorry again, it's a connection between Harold Shipman and York. Harold Shipman was in the retreat because he was addicted to drug.
Yeah, he had a pethidine addiction.
Suggesting he left the retreat, said it would be a great shame if this man was lost.
Wow. Wow.
It's amazing.
So no, I think the other thing is it shows these people are great actors then as well, doesn't it? They pull the wool over everybody's eyes, including professionals. So yeah.
All the problems it might inspire people, I guess you could say, like copycats? Or do you think it's important that people should know about these things?
Well, in the era of social media, when you look at what's in the news and then what comes on social media, and I often think, is that just going to get more people doing it? So I think it's legitimate if it's well balanced and historical and doesn't glamorize it to some degree. I personally think the publicity around the Lucy Letby case is not particularly helpful, and I think it'd be very hard if that goes back to appeal to get a fair trial. And it will depend who you believe. I mean, there are lots of websites, proclaiming her innocence and things. But if you look back, say, at Bodkin Adams or something historical, I think it's not unreasonable. But to broaden that out, there seems an obsession with true crime at the moment. It's on TV and all the platforms, isn't it? All murders and God knows what. So I suspect if you're susceptible, that probably does influence some people. Yeah.
Yes.
I used to work
in a forensic service down in London, and you often saw lots of professional lawyers, dentists, who would have committed horrific acts. And actually, we're playing Monopoly in the ward one day, the next day we're at the Old Bailey on trial. You know, and this was a thing, a phenomenon, people with charisma that you see all the time. That just leads me to a question. Do you have any comparatives with other medical professionals, vets, for example, dentists, other, you know, professionals that have access to drugs?
I haven't actually, no,
Can you repeat the question? For
Oh,
me?
yes. So Katie, who's a psychiatrist, asked me if there's any parallel with other professions that can access drugs like vets and dentists in terms of their personalities. I haven't looked at that, and I haven't seen anything written about that, but it's an interesting concept. I wonder if these people that are well regarded in their professions become overly self-confident that they're not going to get caught, and they just think they're beyond the arm of the law. And on those grounds, I can see why you've got lawyers and judges and doctors in your practice, and yeah, maybe you get vets as well. But I don't know. I haven't seen any data on it.
Interesting.
Something to look for.
Yeah, well, thank you for those questions there, and for a fascinating talk. Before we give you one more round of applause, I'm going to call on the distant relative of Dr. Bodkin Adams. But to give a book thanks, Paul. Well, thank you for that, Paul. I'm going to get my angles. You won't know when. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that fascinating talk. We've all learned an awful lot, and it was interesting you were talking about insulin being a popular drug, and they used to use insulin because I'm a psychiatrist to treat schizophrenia.
Mm.
Yes, put people into a coma with insulin, and the death rate was, I think, only about 5%. Because brought out of the giving sugar or the injection to bring them. But sometimes it's quite hard to bring people on. And why do they do it? Why do these doctors and people do it? And I'm more interested in why are we so interested? Why is this? Yeah, and there's this obsession, isn't there, as you said, with death and
True crime
that's going on. I suppose what you didn't cover, which is coming more out nowadays, is assisted dying and terminal care, and boundaries between all those things. Which doctors are going to come forward to assist with assisted dying? I don't know. Who's it going to attract? It must be a really difficult area to go into. Yeah. Finally, really, I guess doctors who commit murders have funny names. Taking Cricket, I mean, come on. It's obviously. I like the Dr. Cricket. I mean, not cricket, really, was it? And finally, of course, Bodkin Adams. Name actually. Yeah. So anyway, I won't say any more, and it's been a fascinating talk. So can we all put our hands together to